So good afternoon, everybody. I encourage the people in the back to get closer. We are about to start probably one of the more exciting parts of this terrific conference. I want to start by thanking all the people who made it happen. Thank you, Michael Fromm, the chairman of the organization. Thank you, David and Melanie and the rest of the staff for working so hard to bring so many great leaders here at JCPA, JCRC Network from far and from the Washington, D.C. area. We have really a fantastic panel for you guys. Obviously, the last couple of days were very exciting when it comes to politics, geostrategy, economics, when it comes to U.S.-Israel relations, Trump's new peace plan. And we really hope that by the end of this session, 45 minutes, you can go home and say, I understand this complex reality a little bit better. And when you go to the field and you keep doing your important work, hopefully you will be able to do the work in a more informed and successful way. Let me just introduce my friends here. My name is Efraim Chalamish from New York, and I'm affiliated with New York University. And on the left side, I have Mr. Ken Stein, who is one of the leading scholars when it comes to modern Israel. He leads a center on modern Israel at Emory University. Thank you very much, Ken, for coming all the way from the great state of Georgia. Next, we have Tamara Cofman, Wittes from the Brookings Institute, doing a lot of work when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, U.S.-Israel relations. Thank you very much, Tamara, for being here. And then on my right, not necessarily politically maybe, on my right, Michael Koplow, thank you very much for being here, who is the head of policy for Israel Policy Forum. Thank you very much for being here. We have way too many doctors on the stage, so hopefully you're all covered for this afternoon. Let me just say a few words about peace plan, and then I'll ask you, Ken, a very quick question to open. עושה שלום במרומיו, יעשה שלום עלינו. I think we, Jews, the Jewish community, we pray for peace. We're excited about peace. I can tell you about my own personal story. I grew up with lots of terrorism and wars around me, and still I pray for peace on a daily basis. I'm personally very excited when people work very, very hard to bring peace to the Middle East. Having said that, I'm well aware of the fact that when the largest economy in the world, the United States, when the U.S. government introduces a new peace plan, it never goes easy. There are always different opinions. I can just tell you that if you Google Trump's peace plan, you will see all types of reactions, from pragmatism to arrogance to malpractice. And all these great adjectives are a melange of ideas when it comes to a peace plan. So at the end of the day, when we're trying to understand how the next couple of months or years going to look like, we have to try to bring together different political forces, different geopolitical players. Ken, the first question for you is, the people here, they talked a lot about all types of domestic issues over the last 2 days: gun violence, abortion, interfaith. So the question is, why should we really care about just another peace plan? Why it's so relevant to the work of so many Jewish individuals and organizations here in the States?
This particular idea presented by the Trump administration put in the forefront Israel's security needs, and it was a declaratory statement by the American president, not negotiated between the parties, but negotiated between the Trump administration and the administrations of Bibi Netanyahu. That's number one. Number two, it is presented at a moment when there's it's opportunistic for Israel because it has partners unwritten in the Middle East who want to see better relations with the State of Israel, and that's one of the reasons why I think the Trump administration put it forward now. I also believe Donald Trump did it because he wants everything that Barack Obama received. Namely, I think this is part of his overall process to gain recognition and maybe the Nobel Prize. I know that may sound silly, but I think all the other things he's done in foreign affairs seem to indicate he's trying to create a breakthrough someplace.
Sorry for interrupting. Just if we want to dig just a little bit deeper, because you referred more generally to a couple of different aspects of the peace plan. So maybe I'll just remind the audience what are the kind of main features of the plan in case you focus too much on the Oscars awards and less on Trump's peace plan. So just to remind you, as we're all looking at the map, this is the first time that people are talking about borders. The vast majority of settlements will be part of the Jewish state. You have, for the first time, a structure for a future Palestinian state. It's going to be a connection between the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Jordan Valley still will be part of an Israeli territory. Obviously, in order to make it happen, you will need to find a transportation solution for the Gaza West Bank connection. So in the future, there will be such a transportation solution. When it comes to the right of return, it doesn't exist the way we understood it so far, although there will be some mechanism of compensation. In order to make it happen over the next 4 years, obviously a couple of major things should happen according to the plan. The Gaza Strip will have to be demilitarized. The Palestinian Authority will have to accept Israel as a Jewish state, and obviously all the other groups on the ground like Hamas and other hostile groups will have to take a different side. These are the main features of the plan. And here I want to take it as an opportunity and ask you, Michael Koplow, you've dealt with policy, US policy in the Middle East for a long time. Why do you think this time it's different? We've seen different plans. Why do you think it's different, and why it's going to have a long-lasting effect on the region?
So I think that one of the ways in which it's different is what Ken mentioned. This is the first time that a plan for Israeli-Palestinian peace hasn't been negotiated or attempted to be negotiated between the two sides. This is the first time where we've seen a plan that was formulated between the U.S. and Israel as a bilateral U.S.-Israel agreement, rather than the U.S. acting as a mediator for Israelis and Palestinians to negotiate. That's one. Second, this is the first time we've seen a plan where the details were fully fleshed out by the United States and imposed on the parties, and that's a big deal as well. In terms of its lasting impact, I have my doubts as to whether this plan will actually serve as the basis for a negotiated agreement between the two sides, but I think that in a lot of ways that's not actually the objective. I think that in a lot of ways the objective of this plan is to give US approval for Israel to begin to unilaterally annex parts of the West Bank. And we've seen from the Trump administration and from Prime Minister Netanyahu this idea that as soon as the US and Israel meet and work out the exact territorial parameters, and as soon as they release a map that is not the conceptual map that was included in the plan, that Israel can start to move ahead on the territorial components. And so whether the plan actually ends up being the basis for a peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, which should be what we hope from any plan, I think it will certainly have an impact in that it is going to upend the territorial arrangements in the West Bank, and that's going to have follow-on consequences in a lot of ways.
So you're saying, Michael, that one of the main features that we have to focus on the next couple of weeks and months in order to understand the nature of the relationships and the region is really the fact that it may trigger other unilateral effects that you personally, of course, your organization, track closely. Tamara, you wrote a piece at the forward about the importance of understanding the fact that Israel is accepting a plan written by the US administration. And in fact, I always wondered why the parties in the region are so obsessed with having an external power, whether it's United States or another great nation, when it comes to solving the conflict. In other words, if you look at corporate conflicts, family conflicts, sometimes we solve it by ourselves, sometimes we go to external experts. But here it sounds to me that it's almost critical to have such a power broker. So the question to you, Tamara, based on your recent research and experience, why it's so necessary and what are the implications of accepting such a deal by the Israeli government?
Sure, thank you. First, let me just say it's a treat to be back with you all. I was reminiscing with David before the panel started about the last time I spoke to this group, which was 4 years ago in Cleveland. And we were at the time anticipating a very different reality than the one we're living in today. I know that these past 4 years have presented you with a host of unanticipated and many unasked for challenges, but I think in many ways it underscores the vital work that you do. And so I'm really glad to have the chance to be with you today at what I think, as my colleagues were describing, may end up being a critical moment, a turning point in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I don't want to overstate that, but I think we really can't ignore it. There's a lot of cynicism about peace plans and about American proposals for peace. And some of that cynicism is well-deserved, but I don't think this is something we can just shrug off as, well, they stuck it out there, maybe it'll be a basis for negotiations, maybe it won't. And the reason that I think we need to treat this as a potential turning point is because of this point that Michael and Effie were just talking about, that this is an American plan that was presented formally as a basis for negotiations, but that's not actually how it's structured. How it's structured is as an ultimatum. Here's our vision for peace. We put it out there. The Israelis have welcomed it. We'll see if anyone else does or not. But whether or not the Palestinians engage on this plan, the American government says, we in Israel will come to agreement on a territorial vision, and Israel can begin implementing that vision. Whether the Palestinians engage or not, whether there are negotiations ongoing or not. So in essence, it works as an ultimatum in practice. And that is precisely why I think IPF and other organizations and analysts like myself anticipate that putting this proposal on the table will increase the likelihood of unilateral actions on the ground by the Israeli government that could fundamentally change the shape of the conflict and put it into a new phase. Now, why is it important that Israel, in this case, is welcoming an imposed vision from Washington when, in the past, Israeli prime ministers have seen as anathema plans created in Washington and other foreign capitals and imposed? One reason is because of where Israelis and Palestinians are in the conflict right now. This conflict has been stuck for years. And Israelis have felt that their previous attempts to engage with Palestinians have not brought the results that they hoped for. They no longer have a lot of faith in that process. And so the idea of an external imposition, if it's friendly to their interests, and this plan is very friendly to their interests, is welcome compared to the status quo. That's one. But the other thing, and this goes to the broader nature of international conflict, and then I'll stop. Sometimes, as you said, when we have disputes, we work it out between ourselves. Often, when there's a major asymmetry in the power or resources between the parties, or where there's a very bitter history of disagreement and conflict, they don't trust each other enough to have that conversation, or they don't trust that the other side is going to do what it said. And so the role of the United States as a guarantor of agreement has been very important historically. Even when Israel and the PLO negotiated secretly to get to Oslo, they then brought it to Washington and said, we want you to witness the signing of this agreement. We want you to guarantee this agreement.
It's a great point, especially about the role of the United States. Even today, with the change of geopolitics, geostrategy, you really re-emphasize the importance of the U.S. as a power broker. Ken, let's play the devil advocate for just a second And you listen to Tamara, and you envision a world just in a few days or weeks where finally, after a couple of rounds of elections less than a year, Israel finds its way out of this mess, and you have a different kind of leader. Let's say you have Benny Gantz as the new prime minister. Although now in the horses betting game, it's not necessarily the leading scenario, but it's a plausible scenario. How do you think this Trump-Gantz dynamic going to play if Tamara's analysis about unilateral activities is the dominant one?
Anyone who wants to predict what's going to happen on March 2nd and figure out what's going to happen within 6 weeks after that, I think it's probably easy to determine whether it's going to snow next week. And I mean in Georgia. I'm not talking about here in Washington. Tamara and Michael both said some very valuable things. It's not the first time the United States has been the mediator. Camp David was Carter. Reagan came up with a plan in 1982, but no one followed up with it. We had the Clinton parameters of 2000. Without the United States, there haven't been agreements between Israel and the Arabs, period. Done. Engineer, guarantor, mediator, handholder, cajoler, whatever you want to call it. The United States has had umpteen different roles to play going back to the post-1967 war. That's number one. Number two, I don't believe that the Palestinians have the muscle, the commitment, or the desire at this juncture, given their dysfunctionality and given their division politically, both geographically and intellectually, to deal with Israel in a basis, and Tamara said it right, that there is this amazing asymmetry between Israel and the Palestinians. Furthermore, unlike any other time in Arab-Israeli negotiations, the Palestinians themselves don't have that place on the Arab state agenda or in the inter-Arab state agenda that have credibility or attentiveness that you may have had, let's say, in 78, 79, or you may have had in 1980 when Arafat and Barak walked away from a possibility of an agreement. The Palestinian issue is not as important, even to Palestinians, as an issue in terms of trying to resolve the conflict, as it is to Americans and Americans in the United States who are overwhelmed by the necessity to see this agreement between these two parties reached. You take a look at any of the Palestinian political surveys of the last 5 years, Palestinians themselves tell you, no one cares about us. No one cares about us. And you read the Arab newspapers, and they say, we don't care about the Palestinians, we're weary, we're tired. There's an inverse proportion between what is said in Arab newspapers and what Palestinians say about themselves. I'm not talking about the leadership and what goes on in the United States or what goes on in Western Europe, what goes on with people who want to see a resolution to the conflict. I have never seen, in the following of the Arab-Israeli conflict over 43 years, more of an inversion between what people are hoping for here and what people in the Middle East aren't even worried about. You have states that are falling apart. You have demography, you have economics. Is Syria and Iraq really going to exist? The Saudi-Iranian tussle. You expect the Palestinian issue to be on the agenda? It's not.
Ken, I think that one of the key points that you raise, let me pick up on 2 points. One is, of course, the fact that some of the states in the Arab world indeed supported the initiative, and some of them reacted a little bit differently. It's a reflection of what you just described. But also the second point is the fact that you mentioned the word economics, and I wanted to say a few words on that, and maybe going back to you, Michael. So the plan has a strong economics component. which I personally am a big fan of. In other words, the fact that we can't really execute the plan without understanding the economic context, and you can mention the fact that because of poverty and jobs, and the need to create so many jobs, especially for the next generation in the Palestinian areas, in many Arab states around that, it's very important to talk about the economics part. So the question is, going back to you, Michael, how do you communicate your view on the plan? For example, do you try to focus on the more positive part of the plan from your perspective, the fact, for example, that you're going to generate $50 billion of investment, more modern transportation solution, which will help to connect the Gaza Strip with the West Bank, which unfortunately haven't been connected. Can we actually use this platform as an opportunity to continue with this new renaissance of the Israeli economy? And there are economies, for example, we just saw over the last couple of weeks how the Leviathan, the natural gas source, is now being sold to Egypt directly, and in the future to Jordan as well. And it will be a great way for the Israeli government to help create jobs in these Arab nations. What's your take on that?
The economic component of the plan is interesting. So there are a couple of things that I would say. First of all, I think it's impossible to consider the economics without considering the politics of it. And the reason for that is that almost all of the economic components of the plan require some sort of political arrangement to carry out, where the political arrangement is absent. And I'll give you a quick example that's easy to grasp right away. In order for the Palestinian economy to grow, the Palestinians generally need to have control of what they can import, what they can export, who can come in and out of their country. And the political component of the plan, despite the fact that the economic component envisions, as Effie said, billions, tens of billions of dollars coming into the Palestinian economy, it turns out that under the political part of the plan, the Palestinians don't have control over any of the exits or entries into a Palestinian state. They have no independent ports or airports. They're supposed to bring goods in through Haifa and Ashdod and the port of Aqaba, but in all three of those places, it's subject to either direct Israeli control or direct Jordanian control. Even the crossing that doesn't involve Israel, which is the crossing at Rafah between the future state of Palestine and Egypt, there too, security is subject to an Israeli veto. Even things, for instance, like how many Palestinians can go to a future state of Palestine, the plan envisions for right of return Palestinians going to the future Palestine, but it also says that how many go there is subject to an Israeli veto for security purposes. So it's difficult to see how a lot of the economic components of the plan are going to be implemented given the political and security restrictions that are imposed by the political part, and I think that there hasn't been an effort to reconcile those. And one last point, right now Israeli GDP is about $40,000 per capita, per person, annually. In the West Bank, that's about $1,900. In Gaza, it's less than $1,000. These are economies that are not going to be very easy to integrate in one fell swoop. The idea that you can take such a disparity between the Israeli and Palestinian economies and simply pump in $50 billion and correct that imbalance even within a decade, I think is questionable. And I think for the economic components to work, even leaving aside the political complications, I think there probably has to be a lot more work done on exactly how you integrate these economies and how you account for the imbalance.
So one of the things that you touched very briefly, Michael, and I'll go to you now, Tamara, is the connectivity between the economics part and security and all the other components of the plan. And I think I look around the room and I see people from Pittsburgh and Cincinnati and the West Coast and the Northeast. And when you go to the field, you realize that one of the things that people always talk a lot about and care about is the future of Jerusalem, the state of Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, the capital of future Palestine, etc. Tamar, when you look at the current plan, and I'm sure many of the people around the room, those who are on the phones and those who are not on the phone right now, they've been asked about what's the impact of the Jerusalem decision or proposal on advocacy, on policy. So for example, according to the plan, the Jerusalem will stay the capital of Israel, including the East Jerusalem and the old city that you all love, and I'm sure you visited and been annexed by the Israeli government many years ago. At the same time, we will have some part of East Jerusalem will become the capital of future Palestine. The question to you, Tamara, do you think that this, I know it's a very complex topic, but do you think that the future of the capital is something that the people around the room can work with?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think that the plan as drafted has some significant ambiguities, especially about the future of the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif and the question of religious authority and freedom of religion on the Temple Mount. And I will say that, you know, in the aftermath of the plan's release, getting feedback from Arab capitals and my colleagues in the Arab world about reactions to the plan, there was what the president said in his public rollout, and then they actually got the document. We all got the document, and we're reading furiously through it. And the two things didn't match up. And that created a lot of anxiety for a number of Arab capitals for whom Jerusalem is a matter of not just brotherly or fellowship, but also a matter of their own religious and political authority. So the King of Morocco, who also holds the title of Commander of the Faithful, who claims direct descendant from the Prophet Muhammad, this is part of his own political authority, that he has this connection to one of the three holy cities of Islam. He and the Moroccans have chaired the Jerusalem Committee in the Arab League. So that's one. The Saudis, of course, who hold the other two holy cities of Islam and would certainly aspire for the same role in the third. And the Jordanians, who today, under existing arrangements codified in the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, have a special role on governing the religious arrangements and the upkeep of the mosques on the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif. So the plan says, on the one hand, status quo on the Haram al-Sharif. But then in another part of the plan, it talks about a vision in which all faiths would have freedom of worship on the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif at any time, you know, to be negotiated, but they should all have equal freedom of worship. That's not the status quo. As you probably know, Jews cannot worship freely on the Temple Mount. So what I got back from Arab capitals was, oh my God, what are they doing messing with the status quo in Jerusalem? They worry about its effect on the Jordanian monarchy. They worry about its effect on public sentiment in the Arab and broader Muslim world. And that was, I think, more than any other dimension of the plan, the one that created shock and disappointment.
That's very interesting. That maybe one of the scoops here on the panel, kind of behind the scenes of the kind of sometimes surprising reaction by certain players in the region. Ken, I just came back from one of the discussions here about U.S.-Israel relations on campuses, universities, and all the other things that JCPA deals with. You came to us all the way from an American university, and I'm sure that many students, faculty members, colleagues ask you about the peace plans as one of the leading experts on modern Israel. The question to you is, the next couple of weeks, I'm sure the news will be full of stories from Bibi's trial to another election cycle to US elections 2020. In less than a minute, how can you keep these guys optimistic when it comes to modern Israel, the field that you're so passionate about?
I think I need to stand on one foot, but I'm not sure that would do well with the camera. I don't think anyone. I don't know that anyone's paying any attention on campuses to the Trump plan. Maybe there's a small group of people who are politically engaged and, you know, either love Trump or hate him, or like the Middle East or hate it, or love Israel or want to badger Israel. But I'm not certain this is an issue that has too much staying power or lasting power, number one. Number two, I'm a little concerned that our focus today is on headlines and is focused on the details of this particular plan because of what happened a couple weeks ago. Or we're worried about what's going to happen on March 2nd. I think it's worth our while to go up to about 30,000 feet and look at this from the vantage point of Pluto and look down, even though Pluto's been excluded from the solar system. I think what we need to do is take a look at where this Middle East has come from and where it's headed. And I think we need to be really careful about making judgments about a plan that has the chances of success. I would give it 1 in 10, maybe some parts of it. Where are you going to find $50 billion? You got to find 400 billion maybe just to rebuild Syria. Where are you going to find the funds for this? Now, this may be the great deal, this may be the Trump deal, but we're focused on minutia. I really believe it. We're focused on minutia, and we need to step back and we need to say, what does this plan do to ensure a measure of tranquility between Israel and the Palestinians over the next 2 to 5 years that may not get us what we want in terms of an outcome that's desired?
Right.
Let me just finish one more thing. In 2003, Sharon, halfway through his position as prime minister between 2001 and 2006, stood up at Herzliya and he said, today I'm talking to you about disengagement from the territories. I'm talking about disengagement. It took place 2 years later. He left Gaza. The point is that the Israelis want to unilaterally leave a problem that they can't solve. Maybe this plan of Trump's, maybe there's something to it. But I know Israelis, 70% of them or 60% of them say that we don't want that to be part of ours. Now, we can focus on the 20% of the Israeli public that says it's ours, Judea and Samaria is ours forever, it's the land of Israel, it's going to be the land of Israel forever, we're not going to give it up. But that's 20%. You show an Israeli the details of a plan and they'll say, let me see more of the details. Tamara said that she had the exact right phrase. She said, significant ambiguity. Jerusalem. You need significant ambiguity, and the Israelis will want to unilaterally get out of a place that can be harmful to them in 10 and 15 and 25 years. And most of the people in this audience would like to see Israel to be both Jewish and democratic. I'm sure. I haven't done a polling, but I would bet on it. My concern deeply is that we who follow Israel pay too much attention to the headlines and try and speculate too much on what we think is going to happen, and within 24 to 48 hours it passes us by.
I think, Ken, you described something that I've dealt a lot with, which is short-term versus long-term decision-making process in the Middle East. I think great leaders, including the ones you mentioned before, they really try to find the right balance between making smart decisions in order to survive the day and show peace, prosperity, hope in general, versus trying to be game changers for the long run from disengagement and other plans. Mm-hmm. And I think it goes back to the point about crisis management versus crisis solution. I think one of the biggest development that we've seen in the region is the strategic shift within the Israeli audience, kind of to move from focusing on solving the crisis versus living with it, but living it with a way, as you can just describe so well, living it in a way that we feel comfortable with our daily life, with our neighbors, and with our very thriving economy.
Managing it.
Managing the conflict. Michael, before we get towards the final remarks of this panel, the crescendo of this afternoon, Michael, do you agree with Ken's point that this Trump's peace plan basically will kind of, on campuses, maybe think tanks, maybe your competing think tanks and NGOs, over the next couple of months it's going to disappear, or you actually think that it's going to take a significant part of our discourse, discussions, maybe advocacy work on the ground, whatever your political view, on the right, on the left?
So I'll leave campuses to Ken, because that is clearly his area of expertise and not mine. But certainly within the policy community, it's going to be talked about, and I think that a lot of that the extent to which it's talked about and engaged with will depend on what the actual political actors do. Right now, of course, there's an election coming in Israel on March 2nd. If Prime Minister Netanyahu wins, he has publicly said that he will work with the Trump administration to implement the territorial aspects of the plan, and if that happens, obviously we'll still be talking about it. If Prime Minister Netanyahu does not win and there is a continuing deadlock, or if Benny Gantz is able to form a government, I think that it's certainly cloudier as to what will happen and to what extent this plan will be acted upon or engaged with. But to Ken's point about what should be happening, I agree entirely. We should be focused on the larger trends, and maintaining Israel as Jewish and democratic and secure should be the single trend that everybody in this room is most concerned with. And that's what we should be thinking about, how to make sure that Israel remains Jewish, democratic, and secure going forward. And whether or not this plan does the trick, we really should be keeping our eyes on that ball and really focusing on that ball to the exclusion of all of the other noise that's out there.
As we get closer towards the end of this great panel, I want to actually talk a little bit about domestic issues in the States and the Trump plans, because I can imagine, whether I agree or disagree with Ken and you, Michael, one thing for sure, that certain political players here in the States, as part of the elections 2020, will use Trump's plan, peace plan, economic plan, as a way to show success or lack thereof, depends, I guess, on your political view, when it comes to the role of the United States in the Middle East more generally. If you guys can, very briefly, I know Ken threatened us not to predict, but if you can, just to say a few words about the next couple of months, because I'm sure that people here in the audience would like to know how this Trump's plan going to play a role in the election season. So maybe we'll start with you, Tamara, a few words.
I mean, I have written before and will be writing some more this year about the way in which American politics and Israeli politics have become entangled with one another. I think to the detriment of the bilateral U.S.-Israel relationship, by the way. And there are a lot of reasons why this has happened. We tend to point to Prime Minister Netanyahu or point to Donald Trump as the progenitors of this entanglement, but I think that both of them are acting on a set of incentives that are the result of bigger changes. So this isn't going to go away, that Israeli politicians are going to try to get the United States or actors in the United States to say or do things that help them back home, or that American politicians are going to use things that Israelis are doing to help them here in their election campaign. And the Trump plan, I think we have to understand in the context of that broader panoply. Now, you know, what's the challenge? The challenge is that our politics here are extremely polarized, and Israeli politics are extremely polarized. And so there's very little room for people who say what we care about is a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, what we care about is the substance of the issues, you're a little bit right, you're a little bit right, let's find responsible policy. There's not much room for that. And if you want a great example of this, you know, look at if not now, you know, going around to the rallies of Democratic presidential candidates and basically sandbagging them with a microphone and a camera and saying, you know, do you support ending the occupation, or are you going to boycott the AIPAC conference, right? And a candidate, you know, responds maybe not even knowing who this is standing in front of them and why they're asking. And then the other side, you know, immediately comes out and says, how could this candidate say this horrible thing, right? It's almost as if the political extremes feed off of one another, right? And so I think there are a couple things that we can sort of hold in our minds as we get through Israel's election season, which may not be over March 2nd, God help us, and our election season. Number one, we can keep in mind the political incentives here and try to look beyond the noise, not overreact to every little thing that hits the headlines. And the other thing is, and this is true, not just for the U.S.-Israel relationship, but for politics in general, and you do this every day. You root yourself in principles, right? Not in tribes, not in political identities, but in principles.
Hopefully.
Inshallah. And here's what I'll say about Israeli politics. The biggest dynamism in Israeli politics is not in political parties. What were the biggest demonstrations in Israel last year? The biggest, masses of people on the streets. Violence against women, right? We had a general strike, and that massive protest on behalf of gay surrogate parenthood, right? Those coalitions that put together those demonstrations and the people who participated were a cross-section of Israeli society, Arabs and Jews, Haredi, Orthodox, secular. This, to me, is where the dynamism is in Israeli politics, but we have to get beyond these silly headlines if we're going to see that stuff.
I love what you're saying, Tamara, because as someone who grew up in Israel, I can tell you that I'm very proud to see my brothers and sisters going to the streets and screaming on a daily basis, whether it's the grocery store or just another great cause. So I think what you're saying is very important as we're getting closer to the US elections 2020 and Israeli elections as well. Unfortunately, we're very close to the bell, but just as we send people back to their home cities and their discussions, people always ask me, give me a good book to read about the Middle East. Just, Ken, I love your point about the fact that we have to think big picture, because 200 years from now we will look back about Trump's plan, and it's going to be a different perspective. So if each one of you can give me one thing to read about the region so people can take notes and become better informed. Ken, give me some homework.
I will. The Palestinians have their own succession issue, which we didn't even talk about. It's not impossible that Congress may take part of the plan and turn it into a piece of legislation. That's happened before when Israel and the United States have come to agreement on something, then Congress then turns it into something that's a piece of legislation. Tamara said something very important, again, about the demonstrations. Let us remember that Israel's unfinished. It's only 70 plus years old. Where were we in 1846?
Ken, I hope we're unfinished.
Well, I don't know. I'm 73. I can't speak for anyone else. The book I would suggest is the book I just finished. It's Dennis Ross's and David Makovsky's book about the 4 Israeli prime ministers. And it was written intentionally so someone would take a look and say, these are Israeli leaders, Begin, Ben-Gurion, Rabin, and Sharon, who made tough decisions. And that's what Israel needs. Israel needs leaders who make tough decisions. So I would suggest the Makovsky-Ross book.
Thank you very much for sharing something to read or to think about. What about you, Michael? If we want to read something interesting about the Middle East, film in the Middle East, economics, politics, women.
So I'll share two, both books. One, and both novels, actually. One is a novel that I recommend to people all the time, so apologies to anybody in this crowd who's heard me recommend this before. But there's an Israeli novelist, Asaf Gavron, who wrote a novel called The Hilltop 4 years ago. And it is a fantastic portrait of Israeli society. It's a fantastic portrait of settlers and settlements and how they're not monolithic. It's a fantastic portrait of Israeli bureaucracy and the logic of unintended consequences. So I would urge people to read that. The other actually has nothing to do with the Middle East, only tangentially so. But for anybody here who hasn't read Michael Chabon's Yiddish Policeman's Union, lots of laughs, so I'm going to assume that many of you have. But for those who haven't, I won't ruin the book, but it starts with a central conceit, which is the idea that in 1948, in the War of Independence, Israel was overrun, didn't make it, and the Jews had to go elsewhere, and that there is a Jewish homeland in the wilds of Alaska. And what's interesting about it is that it gives you a sense of perhaps what world Jewry and what American Judaism might look like without an Israel, not only without an Israel today, but without an Israel historically, and really just how much Israel and Zionism has shaped our lives, and what a big role it plays in American Judaism. And
It's great.
it's an interesting thing to read, to think about really how to appreciate the role that Israel plays in our lives today. So
And
I
by the
recommend
way,
that too.
I'm sure that the Frozen Chosen community in Alaska would love to have you as members if there are any volunteers here last minute. Tamara, what's
Yeah.
your favorite read in order to
my
to help
favorite-
us to understand the peace plan?
My favorite read is too hard to parse at the moment, but there is a brand new book out that I want to commend to all of you who, like me, have struggled to surf the waves of a dramatically changing Middle East over the last decade or so. People who are trying to understand what this Saudi-Iranian rivalry is all about, religion and politics. It's a book by Kim Gaddis, who's a fantastic former reporter for the BBC. She was the diplomatic correspondent at the State Department for many years. It's called The Black Wave. And it's about the Saudi-Iranian rivalry that is shaping the Middle East today. She starts back in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution and the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And just, it's a wonderful story and really, really enlightening.
Terrific. So our goal here this afternoon wasn't necessarily to send you guys back home with all the answers. I think the goal here was to help us all.
Or any of them, really.
The goal is really to help us think a little bit clearly on some of these very nuanced and very complex issues. I think Ken reminded us the importance of thinking about the tension between short-term and long-term. Remember that at the end of the day, although we make decisions on a daily basis, whether it's an institution, think tank, or you're the prime minister, but at the end of the day, people are going to come after you, and you should be responsible for your actions. Michael, on my right, tried to explain the plan from a more nuanced perspective, the economic component, the unilateral component, the bilateral component. And then Tamara finished, I think not by mistake or chance, by this with the regional players, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, or other players, because obviously they've changed dramatically over the last couple of years, and they will have a dramatic role in the way the plan will be explained to the next generations. I recommend you all to follow the Israeli elections coming up at the beginning of March. Of course, exercise your vote if you can do that. I really hope that you will be part of this amazing US election season coming up, and I thank you very much for coming. Have a great afternoon.